My name is Rachel, and at 31 years old, I never thought I would be the one to prove my entire family wrong in the most spectacular way possible. For years, my two older siblings treated me like the family disappointment, the dreamer who would never amount to anything while they climbed their corporate ladders and accumulated their impressive titles. They called me a loser so many times that I almost started believing it myself. But sometimes, the person everyone underestimates is the one who ends up holding all the cards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the youngest of three in suburban Phoenix was like being permanently cast as the comic relief in someone else's success story. My brother Marcus, 5 years older, was the golden child who seemed to excel at everything without trying. Straight A's came naturally to him, he was captain of the debate team, and our parents practically glowed whenever they talked about his achievements. My sister Victoria, 3 years older than me, was the social butterfly who commanded attention wherever she went. Student body president, homecoming queen, the kind of person who made networking look effortless. Then there was me, Rachel, the awkward youngest who spent more time reading business magazines than fashion ones, who got excited about entrepreneurship podcasts while my siblings rolled their eyes. Our house was filled with the constant hum of achievement from Marcus and Victoria, their trophies and certificates covering every available surface, while my interests were dismissed as passing phases. I remember being 12 years old and announcing at dinner that I wanted to start a small business selling friendship bracelets to kids at school. Marcus laughed so hard he nearly choked on his pasta. Rachel thinks she's going to be the next big CEO, he announced to the table, wiping tears from his eyes. Victoria joined in, adding with a condescending smile, "That's cute, Ratch. Maybe when you're older, you'll understand how the real world works." My parents' response was typical. Dad patted my head and told me it was nice to have hobbies, while Mom suggested I focus on getting better grades instead of chasing silly dreams. The message was clear. Marcus and Victoria were destined for success, while I was destined to be tolerated. This pattern continued throughout high school. While Marcus earned a full scholarship to Stanford and Victoria got accepted to Northwestern with plans to major in communications, I struggled to find my place. My grades were decent, but not spectacular, and my extracurricular activities revolved around the entrepreneurship club that I had basically started myself because no one else was interested. Our school counselor looked at my college application materials with poorly concealed concern. "Have you considered more realistic backup plans?" Mrs. Henderson asked during one of our meetings senior year. "Your siblings have set quite a high bar for academic achievement." Even the adults in my life seemed convinced that I was the family underachiever, destined to disappoint. When I announced my intention to attend Arizona State University to study business entrepreneurship, the family reaction was predictably underwhelming. Marcus, home for winter break from his prestigious engineering program, shook his head in disappointment. "ASU? Really, Rachel? That's barely even a real university. And entrepreneurship isn't a real major. You're basically paying to learn how to daydream professionally." Victoria, who was thriving at Northwestern and already talking about internships at major PR firms, was equally dismissive. "I don't understand why you can't just pick a normal career path like the rest of us. Marketing, finance, law, anything that actually leads somewhere. This entrepreneur thing is just going to leave you broke and living in mom and dad's basement when you're 30. The criticism stung because part of me wondered if they were right. Here were my accomplished siblings, both clearly destined for traditional success, telling me that my dreams were unrealistic. Maybe I was just the family dreamer, too naive to understand that most small businesses fail, too optimistic to see that I was setting myself up for disappointment. But something stubborn inside me refused to give up. During my freshman year at ASU, while Marcus was already talking about graduate school and Victoria was landing competitive internships, I threw myself into every entrepreneurship opportunity I could find. I joined student business organizations, attended networking events where I was usually the youngest person in the room, and started reading every business book I could get my hands on. The first real business idea that grabbed me came during my sophomore year. I noticed that college students were constantly struggling to sell their used textbooks back to the campus bookstore for pennies on the dollar, while other students desperately needed those same books but couldn't afford to buy them new. The campus bookstore had a monopoly on the process and was making massive profits while students on both sides of the transaction got exploited. I spent weeks researching and developing a platform that would connect students directly, cutting out the middleman and allowing them to buy and sell textbooks at fair prices. I called it BookBridge, and I was convinced it could revolutionize how college students dealt with textbook costs. When I pitched the idea to my family during Thanksgiving break, their response was swift and crushing. "So you want to be the Uber of used books?" Marcus asked, not even looking up from his phone. "Rachel, this has been tried a million times. Amazon already exists. Chegg already exists. You're not inventing anything new here." Victoria nodded along. "Plus, how are you going to make money? If you're connecting students directly, where's your revenue stream? This sounds like another one of your half-baked ideas that you'll get excited about for 5 minutes before moving on to something else." Dad tried to be more diplomatic, but his message was the same. "Honey, it's good that you're thinking creatively, but maybe you should focus on your grades and think about getting some real work experience at an established company. All this startup talk is just setting you up for disappointment." Their dismissal made me more determined than ever. If my family couldn't see the potential in my ideas, I would prove them wrong through results. I spent the rest of sophomore year and all of junior year developing BookBridge, learning basic coding, designing the user interface, and testing the platform with small groups of students. The work was exhausting and often frustrating, especially when I had to balance it with a full course load and a part-time job to pay for development costs. Meanwhile, Marcus graduated from Stanford with multiple job offers from top engineering firms, eventually accepting a position at Google with a starting salary that my parents couldn't stop bragging about. Victoria landed a coveted role at a major advertising agency in Chicago right after graduation, and her Instagram feed became a constant stream of client dinners and industry events that my mother shared with everyone she knew. "Both of your siblings are really making something of themselves," Dad told me during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "When are you going to start taking your future seriously?" The question haunted me because I was taking my future seriously, just not in the way they understood. While they saw traditional employment and steady paychecks as the only markers of success, I was building something from scratch, learning skills they didn't even know existed, and developing a vision that extended far beyond the security they valued. By senior year, BookBridge was actually working. I had several hundred active users across 3 universities, and students were successfully buying and selling textbooks through the platform. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with users reporting that they were saving hundreds of dollars per semester. More importantly, I was generating enough revenue through small transaction fees to cover my operating costs and even pay myself a modest salary. When I showed my family the early success metrics during Christmas break of my senior year, their response was predictably skeptical. Marcus glanced at my user statistics and revenue projections with the kind of patronizing smile he had perfected over the years. "This is cute, Rachel, but you're talking about a few hundred users and maybe $1,000 in revenue. Real companies measure success in millions, not pocket change." Victoria was equally unimpressed. "I hate to be the voice of reason here, but how is this sustainable? You're in college with basically no expenses. Once you graduate and have to pay real bills, this little side project isn't going to cut it. You need to start thinking about getting a real job before you end up unemployed and broke." Even when I explained my expansion plans, my vision for scaling to universities across the country, and the market research I had conducted showing the massive potential for disrupting the textbook industry, they remained convinced that I was wasting my time. To them, I was still the little sister with unrealistic dreams, too naive to understand that success meant following the path they had chosen. But their dismissal only fueled my determination. If they couldn't see what I was building, that was their limitation, not mine. I graduated from ASU with a business degree and immediately threw myself into expanding BookBridge full-time. While Marcus was collecting his substantial Google paycheck and Victoria was climbing the ladder at her advertising agency, I was working 18-hour days from a tiny apartment, living off ramen noodles and pure determination. The loneliness was crushing sometimes. Family gatherings became exercises in enduring condescending questions about when I was going to get a real job and listening to detailed updates about my siblings' career advancement. When Marcus got promoted to senior engineer with a salary increase that my parents couldn't stop mentioning, or when Victoria landed a major client that earned her recognition in industry publications, I felt the weight of their unspoken judgment. "We're just worried about you," Mom would say during our increasingly strained phone conversations. "Your siblings have stability, benefits, retirement plans. What do you have? A website that might work out or might not. Don't you think it's time to be practical?" But practicality, I was beginning to understand, was often just another word for fear. While my siblings had chosen the safety of established paths, I was creating something entirely new. And slowly, against all their predictions, it was starting to work. The turning point came 18 months after graduation, when Bookbridge had expanded to 15 universities, and I received my first serious inquiry from an investor. A venture capital firm in San Francisco had been tracking our growth and wanted to discuss funding opportunities. The conversation terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure, but it also confirmed what I had suspected all along. I wasn't just building a hobby or a side project. I was building something that could change everything. The meeting with Clearwater Ventures changed everything. 3 months after that initial phone call, I found myself sitting in a sleek conference room overlooking downtown San Francisco, presenting Bookbridge's growth metrics to a panel of investors who understood what I had been building all along. The lead partner, Sarah Chen, had done her homework. She knew our user acquisition costs, our retention rates, and our expansion potential better than most people knew their own businesses. "What we're seeing here is exceptional organic growth in an underserved market," Sarah explained to her colleagues as I watched from across the polished table. "Rachel has identified a genuine pain point and created a scalable solution that generates revenue from day one. The textbook market alone is worth $15 billion annually, and she's positioned to capture a significant portion of that." When they offered me $2.3 million for a 20% stake in Bookbridge, I felt like I was living in someone else's life. 2 years earlier, my siblings had been laughing at my little website. Now, venture capitalists were valuing my company at over $11 million and talking about national expansion timelines. I called my parents that evening to share the news, expecting them to finally understand what I had been working toward. Mom answered on the second ring, and I could hear the television in the background where she and Dad were watching their usual evening programming. "That's wonderful, honey," she said after I explained the investment deal. "I don't really understand all the technical details, but it sounds like someone is willing to give you some money to keep trying. Just make sure you read all the paperwork carefully. These business people can be very tricky." Dad took the phone next. "Rachel, this is exciting, but remember that investors expect results. Don't let this go to your head. You'll need to work even harder now to prove you deserve their confidence. Have you thought about what you'll do if this doesn't work out?" Their response was so predictably cautious that I almost laughed. Even when presented with concrete evidence of success, they couldn't quite bring themselves to believe that their youngest daughter had actually accomplished something significant. When I mentioned that Sarah Chen wanted to introduce me to potential partners at major universities across the country, Mom's response was telling. "Well, just don't quit your day job," she said, apparently forgetting that Bookbridge was my day job and had been for over a year. Marcus's reaction was even more frustrating. When I called to tell him about the investment, he was driving home from work in his Tesla, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice through the car speakers. "2 million sounds like a lot, but that's not your money, Rachel. That's their money that they're letting you spend. The real question is whether you can generate returns that justify their investment. Most startups fail, you know. Having funding doesn't change that fundamental reality." He paused, and I could practically hear him calculating. "Also, if they're taking 20% for 2.3 million, that means they think your company is worth about 11 million. But that's just on paper. Until you actually sell the company or go public, those valuations are basically theoretical. I'd be careful about getting too excited about money that doesn't actually exist yet." Victoria's response was similarly dismissive, though she approached it from a different angle. "I'm happy for you, Rach, but you know how volatile these tech investments can be. One day you're worth millions, the next day the market crashes and you're back to zero." At least in my industry, I know exactly what I'm worth, and I get paid every 2 weeks, whether the stock market is up or down. She was calling from her office, where she was working late on a campaign for a major retail client, and her tone carried the familiar note of older sister condescension that I had been hearing my entire life. Have you thought about what you're going to do for health insurance now and retirement planning? These are the kinds of practical considerations that entrepreneurs often overlook until it's too late. Their inability to celebrate my success only motivated me further. With Clearwater's funding and expertise, Bookbridge expanded to 50 universities within 6 months. We hired our first employees, developed a mobile app that students loved, and began exploring partnerships with campus bookstores who wanted to offer our services as an alternative to their traditional buyback programs. The growth was intoxicating. Every month brought new milestones that would have seemed impossible when I was working alone in my tiny apartment. User registration was increasing by 30% monthly. Revenue was doubling every quarter. Industry publications started writing articles about how Bookbridge was disrupting the textbook market. And I was invited to speak at entrepreneurship conferences alongside founders whose companies I had admired from a distance. Meanwhile, my siblings continued climbing their respective corporate ladders. Marcus received another promotion at Google, this time to principal engineer with equity packages that my parents described in reverent tones during family phone calls. Victoria landed a major account that earned her a company-wide recognition award and a corner office overlooking Lake Michigan. During our annual family reunion in Sedona that summer, the dynamic felt particularly stark. Marcus arrived in his new Tesla Model S, talking casually about his stock options and the vacation home he was considering buying in Tahoe. Victoria flew in from Chicago wearing designer clothes that cost more than I had spent on my entire wardrobe, regaling everyone with stories about client dinners at exclusive restaurants and industry events in New York. I drove my 6-year-old Honda Civic, wearing jeans and a Bookbridge t-shirt that one of our designers had created, carrying a laptop bag that contained the entirety of my mobile office. To anyone observing our family gathering, it would have been obvious which siblings were succeeding and which one was still struggling to find her way. The conversations that weekend followed familiar patterns. Marcus dominated discussions with technical details about artificial intelligence projects at Google, dropping names of industry leaders and casually mentioning the 7-figure valuations of his stock portfolio. Victoria entertained everyone with behind-the-scenes stories from her advertising campaigns, showing photos of celebrity clients and exclusive events that made our parents beam with pride. When relatives asked about my business, I tried to explain Bookbridge's growth and recent investment, but I could see their eyes glazing over when I mentioned user acquisition metrics and market penetration strategies. Uncle Robert, who owned a small insurance agency, patted my shoulder sympathetically after one such explanation. "Well, it sounds like you're keeping busy," he said, with the kind of smile adults give children who are describing elaborate imaginary games. Just remember that there's nothing wrong with working for someone else. Some of us aren't cut out to be big business owners, and that's perfectly fine. The most painful moment came during our final family dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Red Rocks. Dad stood up to make a toast, raising his wine glass with the ceremonial formality he reserved for special occasions. "I want to celebrate my children and how proud your mother and I are of what you've accomplished," he began, looking first at Marcus and then at Victoria. "Marcus, your success at Google shows what can be achieved through hard work and excellence. You're building technology that will change the world. Victoria, your creativity and business acumen have made you one of the rising stars in your industry. You've both proven that dedication and smart choices lead to real success." He paused, turning toward me with what I recognized as his encouraging the slower child expression. "And Rachel, we're proud of you for pursuing your interests and trying new things. Entrepreneurship is challenging, and not everyone is brave enough to take risks. Whatever happens with your business venture, you're learning valuable lessons that will serve you well in whatever career you eventually choose." The distinction was crystal clear. Marcus and Victoria had achieved success. I was still trying to figure things out. Even with millions in venture funding and a rapidly growing company, I was still seen as the family member who hadn't quite found her way yet.
That night, alone in my hotel room, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I stopped trying to prove myself through explanations and started focusing entirely on results. If my family needed concrete evidence of success before they would take me seriously, I would give them evidence that was impossible to ignore. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 3 months after the family reunion, a major education technology company based in Austin reached out through Sarah Chen. EduTech Solutions had been tracking Bookbridge's growth and wanted to discuss a potential acquisition. They were building a comprehensive platform for college students and saw our textbook marketplace as a perfect fit for their ecosystem. The initial conversations were exploratory, but within weeks, it became clear that they were serious about a deal. EduTech CEO, David Park, had built his company from a small software startup to a billion-dollar enterprise that served over 3 million students across North America. He understood exactly what Bookbridge represented and why our user base was so valuable. "You've built something that solves a real problem," David told me during one of our video calls. "More importantly, you've proven that students will actively use and recommend your platform. That kind of organic growth and user loyalty is exactly what we're looking for." As the acquisition talks progressed, the numbers being discussed moved far beyond anything I had imagined when I first started selling textbooks from my dorm room. EduTech was talking about valuations that would make all of Clearwater's projections look conservative. They wanted to integrate Bookbridge into their larger platform, but keep me on as the head of marketplace development, essentially giving me control over a division that would serve millions of students. I kept the negotiations private, sharing details only with Sarah Chen and my lawyers. Not because I was trying to be secretive, but because I had learned that my family's skepticism was more exhausting than motivating. I would tell them when there was something definitive to announce, when the contracts were signed and the money was real. The final offer came on a Tuesday morning in October. EduTech wanted to acquire Bookbridge for $47 million in cash and stock, with additional performance bonuses that could bring the total to over $60 million if we hit certain integration milestones. After 3 years of being told I was wasting my time with unrealistic dreams, I was looking at a deal that would make me wealthier than both of my siblings combined. More importantly, the acquisition would allow Bookbridge to reach every college student in North America within 2 years. The platform I had built to help a few hundred students save money on textbooks would soon be serving millions, potentially saving them hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The impact would be exactly what I had envisioned during those lonely nights working in my apartment, wondering if anyone would ever understand what I was trying to build. The signing took place on a Thursday afternoon in Austin, in EduTech's headquarters over Lady Bird Lake. As I wrote my signature on the final document, officially transferring ownership of Bookbridge to EduTech Solutions, I realized that everything was about to change. Not just my financial situation, but my entire relationship with my family and their perception of what I had been working toward all these years. That evening, sitting in my hotel room with a glass of champagne and a stack of legal documents that represented the biggest business deal of my life, I finally called my parents to share the news. It was time for my siblings to learn what those company buyout papers actually said. Mom answered on the first ring, her voice carrying the usual mixture of maternal concern and barely concealed worry that had become our standard dynamic over the past few years. Dad picked up the extension in their bedroom, and I could hear the familiar sound of him settling into his reading chair, probably expecting another update about user growth statistics that he wouldn't quite understand.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Hi, sweetheart. How are things going with your business?" Mom asked, using the tone she might employ when asking about a hobby that was taking up too much time. "Are you still working those long hours? You know, your cousin Jennifer just got promoted to regional manager at her accounting firm. She has weekends off and full benefits." I took a deep breath, looking out at the Austin skyline from my hotel window. The city lights twinkled below, and somewhere in this building was David Park, probably already planning how to integrate Bookbridge into EduTech's platform for maximum impact. The contrast between my reality and my parents' perception of it had never felt more dramatic. "Actually, I have some news to share," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Bookbridge was just acquired by EduTech Solutions. The deal closed this afternoon." There was a pause. I could hear Dad shifting in his chair, the leather creaking slightly. Mom made a small sound that might have been confusion or surprise. Acquired? Dad repeated slowly. What does that mean exactly? Did they buy your website? They bought the entire company, I explained, for $47 million, with additional performance bonuses that could bring it to over $60 million depending on integration milestones. I'll also be staying on as head of marketplace development, overseeing a division that serves 3 million students. The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Mom spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Did you say $47 million? Yes, $47 million in cash and stock. Another pause. Then Dad cleared his throat in the way he did when he was trying to process information that didn't fit his existing framework for understanding the world. Rachel, are you sure you understood the terms correctly? That seems like an enormous amount of money for a textbook website. Are you certain they're not talking about the total value of the company, with your portion being much smaller? I had expected this reaction, but it still stung. Even when presented with numbers that should have been impossible to misinterpret, they couldn't quite believe that their youngest daughter had accomplished something this significant. I own 78% of Bookbridge after the venture funding, I explained patiently. EduTech is acquiring 100% of the company. Yes, I'm sure I understood the terms correctly. I spent 6 hours with lawyers reviewing every detail. Mom started crying then, soft, hiccuping sobs that reminded me of my childhood when she would get overwhelmed by good news or bad news in equal measure. But there was something different in these tears, a quality I couldn't quite identify. Oh, honey, she managed between sobs. We had no idea. We thought you were just playing around with computers. We were so worried about your future, about what would happen when you couldn't pay rent or when you got sick and needed real insurance. We never. Dad jumped in, his engineering mind apparently working to recalculate everything he thought he knew about my life over the past 3 years. Rachel, this is extraordinary. I don't think we understood the scope of what you were building. When you talked about users and revenue, the numbers seemed so small. How did it grow so quickly? For the next 20 minutes, I found myself explaining the business model, the market opportunity, and the strategic value that EduTech saw in our platform. It was surreal to be having this conversation with my parents, who had spent years suggesting I find a more practical career path. They asked detailed questions about the acquisition process, about my role in the new company, about the financial implications of the deal. So you'll be managing a team of how many people? Mom asked, having stopped crying and moved into what I recognized as her information-gathering mode. Initially about 40 employees, but we're planning to expand to over 100 within the first year as we integrate with EduTech's existing platforms. And your salary will be? Dad prompted. Base salary of $250,000 plus equity in EduTech plus performance bonuses tied to division growth targets. I heard him whistle softly, a sound he usually reserved for moments when the Arizona Cardinals scored an unexpected touchdown. The hardest part was still ahead. I needed to call Marcus and Victoria, and I was dreading their reactions almost as much as I had been anticipating them. Marcus answered his phone while walking between meetings at the Google campus, his voice distracted and slightly impatient. Hey, Rachel, what's up? I've only got a few minutes before my next conference call. Bookbridge was acquired today by EduTech Solutions for $47 million. The line went completely silent. I could hear ambient noise from the Google campus, the sound of people walking and talking in the background, but Marcus had apparently stopped moving entirely. I'm sorry, what did you just say? I repeated the information, adding details about the acquisition terms and my new role. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for so long that I started to wonder if the call had dropped. Marcus, are you there? Yeah, I'm here. I'm just processing this. $47 million for Bookbridge? The textbook thing? Yes, the textbook thing. Rachel, that's... He paused, and I could practically hear him trying to formulate a response that wouldn't sound like the condescending skepticism that had characterized our relationship for so long. That's incredible. I had no idea the company was worth that much. I mean, I knew you were working hard, but I thought it was more of a side project that might eventually turn into a small business. There was genuine surprise in his voice, maybe even a hint of respect. For the first time in our adult relationship, Marcus sounded like he was talking to an equal rather than his misguided little sister. "How did you keep this quiet?" he asked. "I mean, if you were in acquisition talks with a major company, that's huge news. When did this all start happening?" I explained the timeline, from the initial venture capital investment through the months of negotiations with EduTech. As I talked, I could hear Marcus processing the information, probably cross-referencing it with his own understanding of tech industry acquisitions and startup valuations. "This is legitimately impressive," he said finally. "I owe you an apology. We all do. I completely underestimated what you were building. $47 million is serious money, and if EduTech is willing to pay that much, it means you created something with real strategic value." Victoria's reaction was even more dramatic. She was at her apartment in Chicago, apparently cooking dinner, when I called with the news. The sound of sizzling stopped abruptly when I told her about the acquisition. "Wait, hold on. Stop cooking. $47 million? For your textbook business?" "Yes." "Rachel, are you being serious right now? Because if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny." "I'm completely serious. The contracts were signed this afternoon. I'm in Austin right now, at EduTech's headquarters." I heard her turn off the stove and sit down heavily in what I assumed was her dining room chair. "Oh my God. Oh my God, Rachel. I feel like such an idiot. We've been treating you like you were playing around with some hobby business, and you just sold your company for more money than I'll probably make in my entire career." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, and I realized she was crying. "Vic, you don't need to feel bad about—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "I absolutely do need to feel bad about this. Do you know what I said to Mom last month? I told her she should encourage you to start looking for a real job because this entrepreneur phase was going on too long. I was worried you were going to waste your entire 20s chasing some impossible dream." The conversation with Victoria lasted over an hour. She wanted to understand every detail of the business, from the original concept through the acquisition. She asked about the challenges I had faced, the moments when I had doubted myself, the strategies that had ultimately led to success. It was the longest, genuine conversation we had shared since high school. "I'm proud of you," she said near the end of our call, "and I'm ashamed of how we treated your ambitions. You saw something that none of us could see, and you had the courage to pursue it even when everyone around you was telling you it was unrealistic." The most unexpected call came the next morning. My phone rang at 7 a.m. Austin time, and I saw Marcus's name on the screen. He was calling from his car, probably on his way to work, and his voice had an energy I hadn't heard in years. "I've been thinking about our conversation all night," he said without preamble. "I want to understand how you did this. Not just the business side, but the psychological side. How did you keep believing in yourself when everyone around you was skeptical? How did you maintain focus when all the feedback you were getting suggested you were wasting your time?" It was a question I had never expected from Marcus, whose life had followed such a straight line from academic achievement to professional success. The idea that he might want to learn something from my experience was almost surreal. I think I stopped caring about external validation and started focusing entirely on user feedback, I told him. Students were telling me that BookBridge was solving a real problem for them, saving them money, making their lives easier. That feedback was more powerful than family skepticism or industry conventional wisdom. "That's what I've been thinking about," Marcus said. "I've been successful by following established paths, doing what was expected, meeting benchmarks that other people set. You created your own benchmarks and your own definition of success. That takes a different kind of intelligence than I've ever developed." The admission was so unlike the Marcus I had grown up with that I wondered if the acquisition news had somehow fundamentally shifted his entire perspective on success and achievement. Over the following weeks, as news of the acquisition spread through industry publications and social media, my relationship with my family underwent a complete transformation. Relatives who had barely acknowledged my business at family gatherings were suddenly asking detailed questions about entrepreneurship and startup funding. My parents started sharing news articles about the acquisition with their friends, their voices carrying a pride I had never heard when they talked about my accomplishments. The most significant change was in how my siblings related to me. Marcus started calling regularly to discuss business strategy and career development, treating me as someone whose insights might be valuable to his own professional growth. Victoria began consulting me about a side business idea she had been considering, asking for advice about market research and customer validation. But the real victory wasn't the money or the recognition or the shifted family dynamics. It was the knowledge that I had trusted my own judgment when everyone else had doubted it, and that trust had been justified in the most spectacular way possible. The company buyout papers didn't just prove my financial success, they proved that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one who sees opportunities that others miss entirely. Standing in my new office at EduTech, looking out at a view that would have been unimaginable when I was selling textbooks from my dorm room, I realized that being called a loser had been the best motivation I could have received. It had forced me to define success on my own terms, and those terms had led to something far more meaningful than conventional achievement. Sometimes, the greatest gift your family can give you is underestimating your potential so completely that you have no choice but to exceed it. 6 months after the acquisition, I moved into a penthouse apartment in downtown Austin with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Colorado River. The space was a far cry from the cramped studio where I had built Bookbridge, with its exposed brick walls, chef's kitchen, and enough room for a proper home office. But the most surreal part wasn't the luxury. It was the silence from my phone during family gatherings. For the first time in my adult life, nobody was asking when I planned to get serious about my career. Nobody was suggesting I consider more practical alternatives or warning me about the instability of entrepreneurship. Instead, my extended family had developed an almost comical deference to my opinions on everything, from stock market trends to vacation destinations, as if financial success had somehow made me an expert on subjects completely unrelated to textbook marketplaces. The shift in family dynamics was both gratifying and occasionally uncomfortable. At my cousin Jennifer's wedding in Denver, relatives who had barely acknowledged my existence during previous gatherings suddenly wanted detailed conversations about business strategy and investment opportunities. Uncle Robert, who had patronizingly suggested I consider working for someone else just 2 years earlier, cornered me during the cocktail hour to pitch his idea for digitizing insurance sales. "You've got that entrepreneurial magic," he said earnestly, gesturing with his whiskey glass. "I've been thinking about disrupting the insurance industry the way you disrupted textbooks. Maybe we could partner on something." The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who had dismissed my ambitions as unrealistic were now treating those same skills as almost mystical abilities that could be applied to any industry. Success, I was learning, didn't just change how people saw your past decisions, it changed how they saw your fundamental capabilities as a person. Marcus and Victoria's evolution was more nuanced and ultimately more meaningful. Marcus had thrown himself into understanding the entrepreneurship ecosystem with the same methodical intensity he brought to engineering problems. He started attending startup meetups in San Francisco, reading business development books, and asking increasingly sophisticated questions about market analysis and customer acquisition strategies. "I've been thinking about leaving Google," he told me during one of our monthly video calls. "Not immediately, but maybe in a couple of years. I have some ideas for developer tools that could solve problems I encounter every day at work." The admission was remarkable coming from someone who had built his entire identity around the security and prestige of working for one of the world's most successful companies. But more than that, it represented a fundamental shift in how he thought about risk and reward. "What changed your mind?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Watching what you accomplished," he said simply. "I always thought the smart play was to work for established companies, let other people take the risks, and collect a steady paycheck. But you proved that sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risks at all. I'm 33 years old, and I've never created anything that didn't exist before. You built something from nothing that changed people's lives." Victoria's transformation was equally dramatic but expressed differently.
She had started consulting with small businesses on marketing strategy, using her agency experience to help entrepreneurs develop their brand positioning and customer outreach. More importantly, she was applying the lessons she had learned from watching my journey to her own approach to career development. I realized I was playing it safe in the same way Marcus was, she explained during a weekend visit to Austin. I was climbing someone else's ladder instead of building my own. You showed me that it's possible to create your own definition of success instead of just accepting whatever definition your industry hands you. She had launched her own boutique marketing firm 6 months after my acquisition, focusing specifically on women-owned businesses in the Chicago area. The company was still small, but it was growing steadily, and more importantly, it was entirely hers. I finally understand what you meant about user feedback being more important than family opinion, she said as we walked along Lady Bird Lake. My clients are telling me that I'm helping them reach customers they never thought they could connect with. That validation is completely different from getting praised by my boss for executing someone else's vision. The professional success had opened doors I hadn't even known existed. Harvard Business School invited me to guest lecture on entrepreneurship and market disruption. Forbes included me in their 30 under 30 list for education technology. Industry conferences competed to have me as a keynote speaker, paying fees that exceeded my entire first-year revenue from Bookbridge. But the most meaningful opportunity came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth Santos, who had been my entrepreneurship professor at Arizona State, reached out to see if I would be interested in establishing a scholarship fund for students from working-class backgrounds who wanted to start their own businesses. So many students have brilliant ideas, but no family financial safety net to pursue them, she explained during our phone conversation. They end up taking traditional jobs not because they lack entrepreneurial vision, but because they can't afford to fail. Your story could change that for dozens of students. The Rachel Martinez Entrepreneurship Fellowship launched the following semester, providing $50,000 annually to undergraduate students whose business concepts showed genuine market potential. The first recipient was a 19-year-old named Carlos Restrepo, whose idea for connecting Latin American immigrants with verified home repair services had the same practical simplicity that had attracted me to the textbook problem years earlier. Meeting Carlos reminded me of my own 19-year-old self, full of conviction about problems that adults dismissed as insignificant. He had the same stubborn optimism I had carried through years of family skepticism, the same willingness to work 18-hour days on something that might not succeed. My parents think I'm crazy for turning down internship offers to work on this full-time, he told me during our quarterly mentorship meeting. They want me to focus on getting good grades and finding a secure job after graduation.
The conversation could have been lifted directly from my own experience, and it crystallized something I had been thinking about since the acquisition. Success hadn't just vindicated my individual choices, it had validated an entire approach to thinking about career development and risk assessment that challenged conventional wisdom about security and achievement. Working with Carlos and the other fellowship recipients became the most rewarding part of my new role at EduTech. These students were building solutions to problems that established companies had never noticed, approaching market opportunities with fresh perspectives that weren't constrained by industry conventional wisdom. Maria Gonzalez was developing an app to help first-generation college students navigate financial aid and academic support services. David Kim had created a platform connecting international students with host families for cultural exchange experiences. Sarah Johnson was building a marketplace for sustainable fashion specifically targeted at college campuses. Each of their businesses addressed real problems that I recognized from my own university experience, but none of them were obvious opportunities to people who hadn't lived those specific challenges. They were doing exactly what I had done with Bookbridge, identifying friction points that others had accepted as unavoidable and building elegant solutions that seemed obvious only in retrospect. The fellowship program also gave me perspective on how unusual my family situation had actually been. Most of the students I mentored had families who were supportive but simply lacked the context to understand entrepreneurship as a viable career path. Their parents worked traditional jobs and wanted their children to have the security they had never experienced themselves. But unlike my siblings, these families didn't dismiss their children's ambitions as unrealistic. They asked questions, tried to understand the business models, and offered whatever support they could provide. The contrast made me realize that Marcus and Victoria's skepticism had been about more than just risk aversion. It had been about competition and control, about maintaining a family hierarchy that positioned them as the successful siblings and me as the one who needed guidance. That realization led to some difficult but necessary conversations with my parents about the patterns that had defined our family dynamics for so long. During a visit to Phoenix 18 months after the acquisition, I finally addressed the favoritism and dismissiveness that had shaped my entire childhood. You taught me that my ideas and ambitions were less valuable than Marcus and Victoria's, I told them as we sat in their backyard, the same space where I announced my intention to start selling friendship bracelets at age 12. Even when I was succeeding, you couldn't see it because you had already decided I was the impractical dreamer. Dad was quiet for a long time, staring at the desert landscape beyond their fence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a regret I had never heard before. "We were trying to protect you from disappointment," he said. "Marcus and Victoria chose safe paths that we understood. We could see how their choices would lead to stable careers and comfortable lives. When you talked about starting businesses, all we could see were the ways it might not work out." Mom nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "We thought we were being responsible parents by encouraging you to be realistic. We never considered that our definition of realistic might be too narrow, or that you might see opportunities we couldn't imagine." The conversation was painful but cathartic. For the first time, my parents acknowledged that their skepticism had been based on their own limitations rather than mine. More importantly, they recognized how their response to my ambitions had affected not just my business choices, but my relationship with the entire family. "We're proud of what you've accomplished," Dad continued, "but we're ashamed that you had to do it without our support. You succeeded not because of our parenting, but despite it." That acknowledgement didn't erase years of frustration and hurt, but it created space for a different kind of relationship moving forward. Instead of seeking their approval for my choices, I could simply share my experiences with people who were finally ready to listen without judgment. The financial freedom from the acquisition had also allowed me to pursue interests that had nothing to do with business development or market disruption. I had started taking pottery classes, learning Spanish, and traveling to places I had only read about during those late-night work sessions in my studio apartment. The world felt larger and more accessible than it ever had before. But the most significant change was internal. The constant anxiety about proving myself had disappeared entirely. For decades, I had carried the weight of my family's expectations and disappointments, always wondering if they might be right about my limitations. The acquisition had settled that question definitively, not just for them, but for me. I no longer felt the need to justify my choices or defend my decisions to people who hadn't shared my vision from the beginning. Success had given me the confidence to trust my own judgment completely, even when facing new challenges that had nothing to do with business or entrepreneurship. This confidence had practical implications beyond personal satisfaction. At EduTech, I was leading initiatives that senior executives initially questioned, pushing for product developments that seemed risky or unconventional. But my track record with Bookbridge had earned me the credibility to pursue those ideas without constant second-guessing. The marketplace division I managed had expanded beyond textbooks to include everything from research materials to internship opportunities to study abroad programs. We were becoming the comprehensive platform for college student needs that David Park had envisioned, and the growth metrics exceeded everyone's projections. More importantly, we were achieving the impact I had dreamed about during those early days of Bookbridge development. Student surveys showed that our platform was saving the average user over $800 per year, money that could be redirected toward living expenses, emergency funds, or educational opportunities that would have been financially impossible otherwise. The letters and emails from students who had been helped by our services reminded me constantly why I had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about proving my family wrong or achieving financial success, though both of those outcomes had been satisfying. It was about solving real problems for people who needed solutions that nobody else was providing. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that being underestimated had actually been a competitive advantage. While Marcus and Victoria were focused on meeting external expectations and following established paths, I had been free to pursue opportunities that others dismissed as insignificant. Their skepticism had forced me to develop independent judgment and self-reliance that served me well when facing challenges that had no conventional solutions.
The family dynamics that had once been a source of pain had ultimately become a source of strength, not because the pain was justified or necessary, but because learning to succeed without validation had prepared me for the loneliness and uncertainty that define entrepreneurial ventures. Now, 3 years after the acquisition, I can honestly say that the relationships with my siblings are stronger than they've ever been. We've moved beyond the competitive patterns of our childhood into genuine mutual respect and support. Marcus regularly asks for advice on his startup planning, and Victoria consults me on strategic decisions for her marketing firm. But more than that, we've all learned to define success in our own terms, rather than comparing ourselves to each other or trying to meet someone else's expectations. The acquisition papers proved that I wasn't a loser, but the real victory was discovering that I had never needed anyone else's approval to validate my worth in the first place. The journey from dismissed younger sister to successful entrepreneur taught me that sometimes the people who doubt you the most are simply reflecting their own limitations back at you. Your job isn't to convince them they're wrong. Your job is to pursue your vision with enough conviction and persistence that the results speak for themselves. And when those results finally arrive, when the contracts are signed and the numbers are undeniable, you'll discover something interesting. The validation you thought you wanted from others becomes far less important than the validation you've earned from yourself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.